Hello friends, and welcome to another video brought to you by C# Academy. In this video we'll be building a Blazor component which will have 3 states for loading content that we fetch from a web resource. What you'll be learning in this video will be how to build Blazor components. We'll be looking at the Razor component model, and we'll show you how to build your own custom component and how to consume that component. We'll do some CSS styling. We'll add a free CSS styled spinner that we can use when our component is in its loading state. And we'll do a little bit of CSS styling on our component to make it look a little bit better on our own. And finally, we'll learn how to fetch the actual data of an image rather than relying on the browser's img tag to do the fetching for us. So let's get busy. For this video, make sure you're using Visual Studio 2019 version 16.4 or higher. That will allow you to do all of the things that we're going to show during the process of building this 3-state component. So I'm going to go to File and New Project, and I'm going to create a new Blazor app. And I'll accept the default name of Blazor App 17, and I'm going to create a Blazor server app. Most of the things we'll be covering would apply to client-side Blazor as well, but for this demo, we're just going to stick with Blazor server-side. I'll hit Create. And we have a new empty project. If you've never seen a new Blazor project before, it's not actually empty. It has a few sample pages. And what we're going to do is we're going to hijack one of those. And the one we're going to hijack is called fetchdata.razor. And I'm going to run it so you can see what this looks like. But before I do, I want to just change one thing. And what this page does is it goes out and fetches data for weather from a forecast API endpoint. And I'm just going to add a little bit of a delay in here so that we can see for a period of time when our page is in a loading state. Now let me go ahead and run this. So this is what the default templated application looks like as provided by Microsoft, and it just has 3 pages, a home page, a counter page that you can click on and see the count increment, shows data binding, and then a fetch data page which loads data from a service. And I added a short delay so that we could see the state that that component is in as it loads its data. And we can see all it does is show text that it's loading. What we'll be doing for this video is we'll be enhancing that, and we'll switch this to a 3-state component where it can either be in a loading state, a fully loaded state, or an error state. An error state is something that you should always take into consideration because services aren't always available and things can crash for various reasons. We'll also change this default text loading, and we'll replace it with an actual CSS styled spinner to show the loading in a more animated, perhaps more refined state. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the top of my fetch data page, and I'm going to change the title to just call it Image Fetcher. And then I'm going to replace the weather data with a request to a web service to provide a random image. And there's a web source out there called Lorem Flickr, and you can look that up and you'll see that you can make requests to it and it'll give you back a random image that you can use for prototyping your application. So I won't be using this weather forecast data anymore, so I'm going to go ahead and get rid of that. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to replace this with an explicit state that our component can be in. And we're going to have a loading container state, which can either be loading, loaded, or error. And then we have a member of that type that we can set in our component. So I'm going to change this condition in our markup to not use forecast, which doesn't exist anymore. And I'm going to use state instead. So if the state equals loading, then we'll go ahead and show the loading text. If we're loaded, then we'll go ahead and fetch the image from our Lorem Flickr site. And we don't need this forecast anymore. What we're going to do down here is we're going to make sure that our state starts off as loading. And then after our delay, we're going to go ahead and set our state to loaded. Okay, let's go ahead and run this. Okay, and if I navigate to the fetch data page, we can see it loading, and now we have a random image. So we're able to see two states, loading and loaded. Let's add a capability to show an error state. And to sort of mock that error state, I'm just going to introduce a random so that we can randomly fake errors. So I'm going to add an instance of the .NET type that's already provided for us from the random class. And I'll create a new random instance. And then down here, after our task happens, we're just going to check and see if the next random value we get out of 3 possible values is equal to the number 2. And if it is, then we'll create an error condition. Otherwise, we'll go ahead and say we successfully loaded. And now in our UI markup, we'll go ahead and add handling for that error state. And we'll just say if we're in an error state, then just show the text that an error has occurred. And now, so we can test our component a little bit better, more interactively, I'm going to add a button that we can click on to fetch data on demand. And I'm going to wrap our content into a containing div so our button can sit on top of it. And now our component states are wrapped in a div. And now we just have to build out this load image so that rather than only loading the image one time when the page loads, we can load it on demand every time the user clicks our new button. So down in our code, I'm going to paste in a method called loadImage. And all it's doing is setting the state to loading like we were before, delaying for the 2 seconds like we were before, and then setting the state. And then here in the onInitialized async, we're just going to make a call to that method. Okay, so now let's run this to see where we're at. So now on the fetch data page, we have our button. We still have the same loading that we had before. We get an image. So now on our fetch data page, we have a button that we can load on demand. Our image is still loading. We see our loading text. And occasionally we get an error. It's a 1 out of 3 chance basically that we'll get an error and a 2 out of 3 chance that we'll get an image. So next up, let's add our stylized CSS Spinner. And to do that, I'm going to navigate to loading.io.css. And this is a site that provides a dozen free spinners that are released under the CC0 license, which is a permissive license so that you can use it on a lot of applications. Now this service also has other spinners that are pro and you pay a small fee for them, but if you see any of these that you like, then you can use those in your site for a fee as well. What we're going to do is we're going to use this spinner right here, which looks like a nice loading spinner. So if you just click on that, then you'll get the CSS and the HTML that you need to show that spinner on your site. So we're going to grab all the CSS, and I'm just going to be a little bit sloppy, and I'm going to paste that right into our site.css under our CSS folder underneath www.root in our Blazor project. And you would probably want to separate this out, but since this is just a demo, I'm just going to dump all this stuff in here. Next, we need the little bit of HTML markup that goes with the spinner, and I'll copy that, and then I'll come back to our fetch data into our markup, and instead of loading here, I want to paste that HTML markup that enables us to show the CSS spinner. And to make our spinner look a little bit better, I'm going to add some of our own CSS styling here. So I'm going to add a class to this div, and I'm going to call that class image-container. And then I'm going to switch over to our CSS, our site.css file, and I'm going to paste in the CSS for that new div so that our spinner can show up on a background that has a little bit of a gray color to it. And we're going to make our containing div a flex container, and we're going to make sure our content is centered and that our dimensions match the dimensions of the images that we're going to be fetching. And one more change, if an error does occur, I want to say an error has occurred, and then I want to let the user know that you can click New Image to try again. And now if we go to our fetch data page, we'll see our nice CSS Spinner. We get an error this time, so we try again. And now we have an image. So we have the basic functionality we need now, but let's take the component that we built right into our page and let's make it into a reusable Razor component that we might be able to use in other areas of our site. So I'm going to right click on shared and I'm going to say add new item, and I'm going to find Razor component, and I'm going to name this loading container. And then I'm going to right click one more time and say add again, and I'm going to add a class because rather than putting our code directly into our Razor file, I'm going to use a partial class. So let me go ahead and add this and I'll explain it. So I'm going to name this class loading container.razor.cs. And that's an important naming convention. So what you want to do is you want to name it exactly the same as your component with the .cs extension. And then the Visual Studio tooling will put it right underneath your Razor component as if it's a member of it. And then we just need to change this class to a partial class. And then what that will allow us to do is it'll allow us to put our code for our component directly in that CS file rather than having our code and our markup mixed together. Either way works fine. It's just an organizational thing. So for this one, I'm going to use the separate partial class. So to implement the code for our new component, I'm going to create several members in this class. And the first one, I'm going to move the enum that we had in our fetch data over here so that it's inside of our component. And then I'm also going to add several members that we'll walk through. So first of all, we have an instance of that enum so that our component will know it's in one of the three states. And then we have three render fragments. Render fragments are a provision that will allow us to enable a consumer of our component to provide the actual content that our component will show when it's in the various states. So we'll have a render fragment for the loading state. Our consumer will be able to provide that. Whatever they put into the render fragment is what will be displayed when we're in that state. And similarly, we'll do the same thing with the loaded state and the error state. So we have three render fragments and a state. And that's all we need for the C# code for our component. And now let's build a markup for our component. So we have our code in a partial class, so we don't need this code and we don't need this header. So what we're going to do is we're just going to determine which of the three render fragments we're going to display in our component based on the state. So this is really dead simple, and it's a good illustration of just how clean the Blazor component model is. So here's our markup, and here is our partial class that you can kind of consider the model, and this could possibly be considered the view. Here's our markup, and here's the control of our state and the render fragments provided by our consumer. Now that we have our component, let's go back over to fetch data and let's make some changes so that rather than controlling its own state with its own markup, that it actually uses our new loading container component. So we no longer need this enum down here. We already have the enum defined inside of the component, so I'll remove this. We're going to keep the state because we're tracking the state inside of our fetch data page. But now let's switch this to use our component rather than using these conditions. So all we have to do here is remove the conditions. And then these three lines are our three states. So now I just need to add our loading container as a tag and then wrap our content with that. And now that I have that, I need to tell our container, our component, which of these three are the various markups for the render fragments. So to do that, I simply add a new tag. This is our loading. This one that actually has the image is our loaded state. So that's the render fragment. And then the final one is our error. Okay, so these three sections of markup, loading, loaded, and error, correspond to the structure of our component and the three render fragments that we added as parameters. And one last thing, we need to tell the component what the state is that it should show. So that's very simple. In Blazor, all we need to do is to bind it. So we have a parameter in our component called state, and all we have to do is bind that to the state that we have inside of our fetch data. So let's go ahead and run this. And if we go to fetch data, we'll see we have the same functionality we had before, but now it's all wrapped into a nice reusable component that we could use throughout our site. And now if we go to fetch data, we'll notice that we have the same functionality that we had before, but now it's all wrapped up into a nice reusable component that we could reuse throughout our site. So that's it. That's how we build a 3-state component in Blazor using Razor components. Now there's one more final thing that I wanted to show, and that is if we take a look at our code, and you may have noticed when I was running the samples, that there's a small issue here. What we're doing is we have a delay for 2 seconds, and then if the random is set right, we switch our state to loaded. But all that does is it tells Blazor, the rendering framework now, to go ahead and then fetch the image. And that's not quite right. We've already switched away from the loading state, so we're relying on the browser to go fetch the data and show the image. So this is just a fine-tuning. We've already done everything we really need to do for the component. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk through and show you how to actually fetch the data for this image rather than relying on the browser to fetch it for us based on the source tag. And in order to do that, we're going to be making a request through an HTTP client. And we're using server-side Blazor. If you're using client-side Blazor, then it makes it really easy to just directly inject an HTTP client in your class. You just have to come up here and tell it you want to inject that HTTP client. We're using server-side Blazor for this demo, so there's a few extra steps you have to do. So I'm going to go over to Startup, and I'm going to add a service for HTTP client. So we're registering an HTTP client factory service with our services. And then back in our fetch data Razor, I'm going to ask the framework to go ahead and inject that HTTP client factory for me. And of course, I don't need this forecast service, so I'll go ahead and get rid of that now. Now what we're going to be doing is we're going to be making that HTTP client request, and we're going to be getting data back, and we're going to convert that data to a string of data that we're going to actually use for the source. So we're not going to be using a URL anymore. We're actually going to be binding to a variable in our class. So I'm going to create that variable down here. It's just going to be string, and we'll call it image data. And up here on our image, we'll be binding to it just with an @ and image data. So I'm going to replace the existing load image with a new one that will make use of our HTTP client. And we'll walk through that in just a second. You'll notice I'm using a memory stream here, and we're getting a red message here that it doesn't know what that is. So I'm going to go up here and add a using for system.io. And that'll take care of our issue with the memory stream. So let's go ahead and walk through this code a little bit. So you'll see just like before, we start off and set the state to loading, and we still have our delay in here. But now we're actually going to go out and fetch the data. So what we do is we build a request using the same URL that we had before to lorem flickr. And then we create a HTTP client instance from the HTTP client factory that we have injected into our class. Next, we go ahead and send the request and await a response. And now that we have an actual response, we can actually use the result of the response, the status code, to actually control our state. If we get a successful status code, then we'll be setting the state to loaded. If we do not get a successful status code, we'll be setting the state to error. So we're not using the random error mocking that we had before. And now let's take a look at this little bit of magic code here that allows us to take the response we got back from our HTTP client request and convert it into a string that the browser can then render as the source for our image tag. And all we're doing here is we're converting the result to a base 64 string, and then we're adding a special prefix to that string so that the browser can understand the format that we're using. And what you have to have is the type of image, and then you have to tell it that it's base 64 encoded, and then give it the data. So what we're doing here is we're tapping into the response, and we're looking at the headers, and we get the content type headers, and we just grab the first one to see what type of image the service sent back to us from Lorem Flickr. And that'll tell us whether this is a JPEG or a PNG or whatever the case might be. So that's all we need to do to convert this into something that we can then send to our image tag. So now up here on source on the image tag, I'll just say we want to use the image data that we actually fetched from the service. So now let's go ahead and run this. So now if we go to our fetch data page, we'll see we have the same functionality we had before, except our image is now being fetched under our own control, and we're checking the status code to see if we have an error or not. And we're not switching state until we actually have the data of the image. And that wraps it up for this. We learned about Razor components, how to create a 3-state component, and how to fetch the data for an image directly from a service. Thanks for watching, and keep cranking on Blazor. It's an amazing framework, and we'll see you next time.